The fog lay gently across Baker Street that evening, not thick enough to obscure the lamps, but soft enough to blur their glow into warm halos of ember light. The street was quiet in the way London sometimes becomes just before Christmas, when footsteps seem fewer, voices lower, and the air itself feels hushed, as though the city has paused to listen to its own breathing. Inside the rooms at number 21B, the fire burned low and steady. Its light flickered softly against the walls, casting slow-moving shadows across shelves, lined with books, papers, and curious objects whose purposes were not always immediately clear. The room was warm, comfortable, and deeply still. Dr. Watson sat in his usual chair, a book resting open in his hands, though he had not turned a page in some time. The fire crackled quietly, each sound unhurried and familiar. From the other side of the room came the faint, thoughtful movements of Sherlock Holmes, who stood near the window, gazing out at the fog, as if it were something to be read rather than merely observed. Neither man spoke for a while. There was no need to. The silence was companionable, shaped by years of shared evenings much like this one. Outside, a distant carriage rolled along the street, its sound softened by the fog. Somewhere far off, a church bell marked the passing of an hour, though its echo arrived gently, without insistence. Holmes turned from the window at last and moved back toward the fire. He lowered himself into his chair with a measured ease, folding his long fingers together and letting his gaze settle on the glowing embers. "Winter suits London," he said quietly, as though continuing a conversation that had been going on in his thoughts. "It encourages people to slow down, to pay attention." Watson smiled faintly, but did not reply. He knew better than to interrupt when Holmes spoke in this manner. Such observations were rarely made for the sake of conversation alone. On the small table between them, a curious assortment of items collected earlier that day: a battered felt hat, its brim slightly misshapen, a length of string, and a folded newspaper. They had been brought in by a man who, in his fluster, barely paused long enough to explain how they had come into his possession before hurrying back out into the cold. The hat now rested quietly, its presence unassuming, yet not without interest. Holmes reached for it and turned it slowly in his hands, examining its worn edges and softened crown. He did not rush. He never did. His attention moved over the object with calm precision, as though time itself had agreed to move at his pace. Watson watched him with mild curiosity. He had learned that the smallest objects often led to the most intriguing discussions, though not always the most urgent ones. "It is remarkable," Holmes said at last, "how much of a person's life can be revealed by the things they leave behind." He set the hat down again, placing it carefully where the firelight could reach it. The elk caught the glow, its surface showing subtle variations in color, marks of weather, use, and long familiarity. Watson leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the fire easing the tiredness from his limbs. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the windows, as if curious about the quiet scene within. "Do you intend to return to this evening?" Watson asked, his voice low. Holmes shook his head. "No, tonight is for observation, not action." The fire sighed softly as a log shifted. Somewhere above them, the building settled with a faint creak, an ordinary sound in an old London house. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, listening not only to the room, but to the absence of disturbance within it. There were evenings when Baker Street was alive with visitors, telegrams, and sudden departures, and then there were evenings like this one, when the world seemed content to wait. Holmes opened his eyes again and allowed himself a rare, faint smile. Christmas approaches, he said. People misplace things during this season, not just objects, but thoughts, worries, sometimes even intentions. Watson felt the words settle over him like a blanket, warm and reassuring. The firelight danced gently, its rhythm slow enough to invite rest rather than demand attention. Holmes rose once more, moving to the sideboard where a kettle rested. He poured hot water into 2 cups, the faint steam rising and curling lazily into the air. The scent of tea followed, mild and comforting. As he handed 1 cup to Watson, Holmes spoke again, his voice softer still. This case, I suspect, will not hurry us. It will unfold at its own pace. Watson nodded, wrapping his hands around a warm porcelain. The quiet felt deeper now, enriched by the gentle sounds of sipping tea and the distant, muted life of the city beyond fog. The hat remained on the table, patient and silent. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light, tentative flakes drifting down through the glow of the street lamps. They made no sound as they landed, only adding to the sense that the night was carefully arranging itself for rest. Holmes returned to his chair, settling in with a posture that suggested not alertness, but contemplation. He gazed once more into the fire, watching the embers pulse slowly, steadily. "There is time," he said at last, almost to himself, "plenty of time." And so the night at Baker Street continued, unrushed, untroubled, and quietly attentive, as the first small threads of Christmas mystery waited patiently to be noticed. Morning arrived at Baker Street quietly, without ceremony. The fog of the previous evening had thinned, retreating into pale wisps that drifted lazily past the windows. A faint winter light filtered into the sitting room, gentle and unhurried, illuminating the familiar shapes of furniture and books, as though they were waking from sleep themselves. The fire from the night before had settled into a bed of soft gray ash, still faintly warm. Sherlock Holmes stood near the hearth, poking at the embers with deliberate care, coaxing a small flame back into life. He worked slowly, as if there were no particular reason to hurry the day along. Dr. Watson emerged from his room a short while later, his steps unhurried, his thoughts still wrapped in the half-dreaming state that often followed a peaceful night. He paused briefly at the doorway, taking in the quiet scene before him. The battered felt hat still rested on the small table, precisely where Holmes had left it. In the clearer light of morning its age was more apparent. The brim was slightly bent, the crown softened from years of wear. It was the sort of hat that belonged to a man who valued comfort over fashion, routine over novelty. Holmes glanced at it as the fire caught once more. "Good morning," he said calmly, without turning. "Good morning," Watson replied, settling into his chair. "It appears our visitor from yesterday has not yet returned." "No," Holmes said, "nor did I expect him to." The kettle soon began to murmur softly on the stove, its sound blending easily with the quiet of the room. Outside, a cart rolled past on the street below, its wheels crunching faintly over frost-dusted stone. Holmes poured 2 cups of tea and joined Watson by the fire. He sat down, his movements precise but relaxed, and reached once more for the hat. "In daylight," he said, turning it gently in his hands, "details become less dramatic, but no less revealing." Watson watched as Holmes examined the hat anew, noting the faint discoloration near the brim, the slightly frayed lining, the way the felt had thinned in places where fingers might often rest. "It has known many winters," Holmes continued, "and not a few walks through damp streets." He set the hat down again, this time beside the folded newspaper that had been brought in with it. Watson reached for the paper, unfolding it with idle curiosity. It was a modest publication, filled with small advertisements, local notices, and seasonal announcements. His eyes drifted over an article describing the bustle of the Christmas markets, the arrival of geese and poultry from the countryside, and the cheerful chaos that accompanied the days leading up to the holiday. Holmes noticed Watson's attention. "London becomes a different place at this time of year," he said. "People move with purpose, but not always with awareness." Watson nodded, reading on. The paper spoke of shop windows newly decorated, of families preparing for feasts, of streets alive with quiet anticipation. The kettle fell silent. The fire settled into a steady burn. Holmes leaned back, folding his hands, his gaze drifting not to the hat, but to the ceiling above, as if he were arranging his thoughts there. "Objects misplaced during Christmas," he said slowly, "are often found in unexpected company." Watson smiled faintly at the observation, though he sensed there was more behind it. Holmes reached for the string that lay coiled on the table. It was unremarkable, plain, slightly worn, and tied at one end in a simple knot. He lifted it, letting it dangle briefly before setting it beside the hat. "Consider," he continued, "how easily such things pass from hand to hand. A man sets something down for a moment. Another picks it up, meaning to return it, perhaps, and then time intervenes." The room remained quiet as Holmes spoke, his voice steady and unhurried. Each word seemed placed with care, as though chosen to fit comfortably into the stillness rather than disturb it. Watson sipped his tea, the warmth spreading slowly through him. He found himself listening not just to Holmes' words, but to the spaces between them, the pauses that invited thought rather than demanded attention. Outside, the street had grown livelier. Footsteps passed more frequently now, and somewhere nearby, a shopkeeper's bell rang softly as a door opened and closed. Holmes rose and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. "The market will be busy today," he said, "especially the poultry sellers." Watson folded the newspaper and set it aside. "Do you believe our hat is connected to them?" Holmes did not answer at once. He stood watching the street, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. Snow from the night before still clung to the edges of rooftops, catching the light. "Belief is necessary," Holmes said at last. "Observation will suffice." He let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the table. Carefully, almost ceremoniously, he placed the hat inside a plain paper bag. "We shall take a walk," he said. "Not to hurry anything along, simply to see what the morning offers." Watson rose without question, reaching for his coat. The act felt less like the beginning of an investigation and more like a continuation of the calm rhythm of the day. As they prepared to leave, Holmes paused, glancing once more around the room, the fire burning steadily, the cups empty but warm, the quiet undisturbed. "London speaks most clearly," he said, "when one listens without expectation." They stepped out into the cold air together, the door closing softly behind them. Baker Street greeted them, with muted winter sounds and pale sunlight, the city already moving, though still wrapped in a gentle restraint. The hat, now tucked away, seemed content to travel with them, as though it, too, were ready to reveal its story, slowly, patiently, and in its own time. The streets grew busier as Holmes and Watson moved away from Baker Street, though the bustle never rose beyond a soft murmur. London, at Christmas time, carried its activity lightly, as if careful not to disturb the winter air. Footsteps echoed faintly on the pavement, and voices blended into a low, steady hum that felt almost soothing in its repetition. The morning was cold but not harsh. A pale sun hovered behind thin clouds, offering light without warmth. Breath appeared briefly with each exhale, then vanished, Leaving the air clear once more, they walked without haste. Holmes set a pace that invited observation rather than urgency. He paused often, not to inspect anything in particular, but simply to look at shop windows trimmed with greenery, at baskets of apples stacked neatly outside a grocer's door, at the quiet determination of people carrying parcels wrapped in brown paper and twine. Watson found the rhythm of walking beside Holmes strangely calming. There was no need for conversation. The city seemed content to speak for itself. As they approached the market, the scent of straw and feathers drifted toward them, mingling with the sharper smell of cold stone and damp wood. Stalls lined the open square, their wooden frames darkened by use and weather. Crates were stacked in careful rows, and baskets rested on the ground, each holding its own quiet order. Geese occupied much of the space. They stood in clusters, their white feathers puffed against the cold, their movements slow and deliberate. Occasionally, one would let out a soft sound, answered by another nearby, and then the market would settle again into its gentle cadence. Holmes slowed further, his gaze moving calmly from stall to stall. "Markets tell stories," he said softly, not loudly, but honestly. Watson nodded, though he did not speak. He watched as Holmes approached one of the sellers, a man bundled in layers of wool, his hands red from the cold. The man was adjusting the position of a crate, moving each goose with practiced care. Holmes greeted him politely, his tone mild and unassuming. "A fine morning," Holmes said. The seller glanced up and returned the greeting with a nod. Cold, but fair. Holmes did not ask questions at once. He simply stood, observing the geese, the crates, the labels tied loosely with string. Some bore marks from earlier journeys, others were freshly tagged. Watson noticed how Holmes allowed time to pass. He waited until the seller resumed his routine before speaking again. "You have a well-ordered stall," Holmes remarked. The man shrugged lightly. "Order keeps things simple." Holmes smiled faintly. Simplicity has its advantages. They moved on without further exchange, blending back into the slow flow of the market. Watson felt a growing appreciation for Holmes' restraint. There was no pressure, no sense of chasing answers. Everything unfolded gently. They passed another stall, and then another. Each had its own quiet character, some busy with customers, others momentarily still. Holmes took note of them all, storing impressions without comment. At the edge of the square, a woman wrapped in a thick shawl was arranging feathers that had fallen to the ground, sweeping them into a small pile. The motion was slow, almost meditative. Holmes paused nearby, his attention drawing not to the feathers themselves, but to the string that bound a crate beside her. It was similar in thickness and wear to the piece that lay back at Baker Street. He said nothing. Instead, he continued walking, letting the observations settle quietly. Watson felt the cold begin to reach his fingers, but he did not mind. The market had a warmth of its own, born of routine and repetition. People moved in familiar patterns, each task performed with quiet competence. Holmes stopped near a stall where a man was carefully examining a goose, lifting it gently, checking its weight. "Looking for something special?" Holmes asked, his voice barely rising above the ambient sounds. The man chuckled softly. "Just a good burr for Christmas." Holmes nodded. "They all look well cared for." "They should be," the man replied. "They have traveled far enough." Holmes thanked him and stepped aside, allowing another customer to take his place. He moved slowly now, as though the market itself were guiding his steps. Watson sensed that something subtle had shifted. Holmes' attention seemed more focused, yet no less calm. They stood for a moment near the center of the square, surrounded by the soft movement of people and animals. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, listening not for words, but for patterns. "Everything leaves a trace," he said quietly, "even when it tries not to." Watson followed his gaze to a nearby crate. It bore a small tear in its fabric lining, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. A piece of straw protruded, catching the light. Holmes did not approach it. He simply acknowledged it, as one might note a passing thought. The market bell rang softly, marking the hour. Its sound was clear but gentle, fading quickly into the open air. Holmes turned away from the square at last, guiding Watson toward a quieter side street. "That is enough for now," he said. "We have seen what we need to see." Watson did not ask what that might be. He trusted that understanding would come later, in its own time. As they walked away, the market resumed its steady rhythm behind them, geese murmuring, crates shifting, footsteps passing. Nothing appeared changed, yet something subtle had been set in motion. The morning light lingered, pale and patient, as London continued its quiet preparation for Christmas, unaware that a small and curious journey had begun. The walk away from the market felt noticeably slower, as though the streets themselves had decided to relax once more. The open square, with its murmuring voices and clustered stalls, faded behind Holmes and Watson, replaced by narrower streets where sounds softened and footsteps echoed gently against brick walls. The air here was cooler, shaded by taller buildings. Thin strips of sky appeared above them, pale and distant, like a ceiling drawn far too high to matter. Holmes walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his pace measured and unhurried. Watson matched him easily, his breath steady, his thoughts calm. Neither felt the need to fill the quiet with conversation. After a short while, Holmes spoke. "The market," he said, "is rarely the beginning of a story. More often, it is the middle." Watson nodded. He had learned to let such remarks settle naturally. Holmes turned down a side street, lined with modest shops. Their windows were filled with simple goods, kitchen tools, coils of rope, baskets, and folded cloth. A faint smell of wood shavings drifted from one doorway, mingling with the cold air. They stopped before a small shop whose sign creaked softly in the breeze. Inside, a man worked at a counter, his attention fixed on a length of twine stretched between his hands. The sound of fiber rubbing against fiber was quiet but rhythmic. Holmes entered without haste, Watson following. The warmth inside was modest but welcome. The man looked up, his expression open and untroubled. "Good morning," Holmes said gently. "Morning," the man replied. Holmes allowed a moment to pass, his eyes moving slowly over the coils of string stacked neatly along the wall. Each bundle was similar, yet none identical. Some were darker, some slightly frayed, some tightly wound. "You sell a great deal of twine," Holmes observed. The man smiled faintly. "More than most people realize they need." Holmes nodded. "Especially at this time of year." "Yes," the man agreed. "Crates, parcels, poultry baskets, all tied in a hurry." Holmes thanked him and purchased a small length of twine, accepting it with quiet appreciation. The exchange felt less like a transaction and more like a courteous pause in the man's routine. Outside again, Holmes walked a short distance before stopping. He compared the twine in his hand to the memory of the string left behind at Baker Street. "They need not be identical," he said calmly. "Only similar in purpose." Watson listened, his footsteps slow. They continued on, passing a narrow alley where snow had collected undisturbed. Footprints crossed it here and there, each one fading slightly at the edges. Holmes paused beside the alley, gazing down its length. "Things that travel together," he said, are often separated by chance. Watson felt the weight of the words without fully understanding them. That, too, was familiar. Their walk eventually brought them to a quieter stretch of street where small houses stood close together, their doors painted in subdued colors. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, dissolving almost as soon as it appeared. Holmes stopped once more, this time before a door that showed signs of frequent use. The paint near the handle was worn smooth, and faint scratches marked the lower panels. He did not knock. Instead, he listened. From inside came the faint sound of movement, someone rearranging furniture perhaps, or preparing for the day. Holmes waited patiently until the sounds faded, then stepped back. "Not yet," he said softly. Watson did not ask what he meant. The day still felt unhurried, as though there were hours ahead in which nothing truly demanded attention. They turned back toward Baker Street, retracing their steps through streets that now felt more familiar than before. The city seemed to welcome them back with the same quiet courtesy it had offered all morning. When they reached their rooms, the fire greeted them with lingering warmth. Holmes removed his coat and placed it carefully on its hook, his movements deliberate and calm. The hat was still where it had been left, waiting. Holmes removed it from the bag and set it once more upon the table. He examined it again, though his gaze now lingered on different details: the lining, the stitching, the faint scent it carried. Watson watched as Holmes inhaled lightly. "Market straw," Holmes said, "and cold air." He placed the hat beside the length of twine he had purchased. "Paths intersect," he continued, not loudly, quietly. Watson sat down, the warmth of the room settling over him like a familiar coat. He felt no urgency, only a gentle curiosity that did not demand immediate satisfaction. Holmes poured fresh tea, the steam rising slowly. "There is a goose," Holmes said at last, "and there is a man who lost more than he realizes." Watson raised an eyebrow but did not interrupt. "We will not rush to conclusions," Holmes added. "The trail deserves patience." The fire crackled softly, punctuating the stillness. Outside, the sound of distant bells drifted faintly through the air, marking the passing of time. Without insisting upon it, Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes half-lidded. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will continue." Watson felt the words settle comfortably. There was something deeply reassuring in the idea that not everything needed to be resolved at once. The hat remained silent on the table. The twine lay coiled beside it. The room held them both, without judgment or haste. And so the day drew to a close, not with answers, but with quiet understanding that answers would come, gently, when the time was right. Following morning arrived, with a softer light than the day before. Clouds hung low over London, diffusing the sun until it became little more than a pale presence behind the sky. Snow from the night had settled quietly along windowsills and the edges of rooftops, smoothing the city's lines into something gentler and more subdued. Inside Baker Street, the fire was already lit. When Watson entered the sitting room, Holmes stood nearby, warming his hands, his expression calm and thoughtful. The hat and the coil of twine still rested on the table, unchanged, as though waiting patiently for their turn to speak. Holmes nodded in greeting. "The day favors listening," he said. Watson took his seat and wrapped his hands around a cup of tea Holmes had prepared earlier. The warmth spread slowly, and with it came a familiar sense of ease. Nothing in the room felt hurried. Even the ticking of the clock seemed untroubled by the passing minutes. Holmes lifted the hat once more, turning it gently. "Objects," he said quietly, "rarely travel alone." He set the hat down and moved toward the window, drawing the curtain aside just enough to look out. The street below was calm, with fewer carriages than usual. A delivery boy walked carefully across the icy stones, his steps deliberate. "We will return to the market," Holmes said, "but not to the noise." Watson rose without question, slipping on his coat as Holmes gathered the paper bag once more. The hat disappeared into it with a soft rustle, and together they stepped back into the winter air. The streets felt quieter than the previous day. Many had already completed their shopping, leaving behind a city content to move more slowly. Holmes led them along familiar paths at first, then gradually veered toward narrower streets where the buildings leaned closer together. They passed small courtyards where geese feathers clung to the ground, remnants of earlier deliveries. Holmes slowed near one such place, studying the ground as though reading a page written faintly in chalk. Watson noticed how Holmes did not crouch or point. He merely observed, hook up small details in his mind. "Feathers," Holmes said softly. "Not many. Enough." They continued on until they reached a modest house set slightly back from the street. Its door was plain, its windows clean, but undecorated. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, steady and unremarkable. Holmes paused. "This is one of the places the geese rested," he said, briefly. Watson listened, his breath visible in the cold air. "How can you be sure?" he asked gently. Holmes smiled faintly. "Because routine leaves patterns," he replied, "and patterns repeat." They did not knock. Instead, Holmes led Watson onward, deeper into the neighborhood. The city here felt more domestic. Laundry lines stretched between windows, and small potted plants rested on steps despite the cold. Eventually, they reached a narrow shop with a faded sign. Inside, a man stood behind the counter, his movements slow and practiced as he sorted small parcels. Holmes entered with a polite nod. "Good morning," he said. The man looked up and returned the greeting, his expression calm. "You sell poultry?" Holmes observed. "Yes," the man replied. "In season." Holmes did not ask about the hat. He did not mention the goose. Instead, he spoke of the weather, of the difficulty of keeping animals warm during transport, of how easily things were forgotten during busy days. The man listened, occasionally nodding. "People mean well," he said at last, "but they hurry." Holmes smiled, and in hurrying, he said, they sometimes overlook what matters. They left without further questions. Outside, Holmes paused, his gaze thoughtful. "The goose passed through many hands," he said, "none of them careless, merely occupied." Watson felt the quiet weight of the statement. They walked back toward Baker Street slowly, the city unfolding around them with gentle familiarity. Holmes spoke occasionally, but only to note small things, the way certain streets curved, the direction of the wind, the sound of distant bells. By the time they returned, the light had begun to fade again, though it was still early afternoon. Holmes set the hat back on the table and removed his coat. "The goose will complete its journey tonight," he said. Watson settled into his chair, the fire welcoming him once more. "And then?" he asked. Holmes poured tea, the steam rising lazily. "Then," he said, "we will see what it carried." The fire crackled softly, as if in quiet agreement. Outside, the city continued its steady preparation for Christmas, unaware that a small, careful mystery was nearing its turning point. The hat remained silent, the twine lay coiled, and somewhere in London a goose moved gently towards final destination, carrying with it a story that was almost ready to be told. Evening returned to Baker Street without announcement. The light outside softened first, then slowly withdrew, leaving the windows darkened and reflective. Inside, The familiar rooms glowed once more with lamplight and the steady warmth of the fire. The day had passed gently. Neither Holmes nor Watson felt compelled to measure it by hours. Instead, it had unfolded in a series of quiet moments, walking, observing, returning, each one blending easily into the next. Holmes stood at the sideboard, arranging a few simple items upon a clean cloth. His movements were careful and unhurried, as though the task itself deserved respect rather than efficiency. Watson watched from his chair, his posture relaxed, his thoughts drifting comfortably. There was no sense of anticipation sharp enough to disturb the calm. Whatever lay ahead felt certain to arrive in its own time. The goose rested nearby, wrapped loosely and respectfully, its presence unremarkable at first glance. It appeared no different from the many others that had passed through London in recent days, prepared carefully, handled with routine familiarity, and brought indoors against the cold. Holmes approached it without ceremony. Even the most ordinary things, he said softly, may carry more than they seem. Watson listened, his gaze steady. Holmes began his work slowly, methodically, pausing often, as though each step were part of a quiet ritual. The room remained still, save for the faint sounds of movement and the soft crackle of the fire. There was no urgency in Holmes' hands, no sudden gestures, only calm attention. When he paused, Watson sensed it before Holmes spoke. Holmes lifted his hand slightly, his eyes focused. "There," he said, not loudly. "That is what we were following." From within the goose, carefully and gently retrieved, lay a small object wrapped and protected, concealed without haste, hidden more by chance than by intent. The stone caught the firelight immediately. Its blue surface reflected warmth and glow, deep and steady, rather than sharp or dazzling. It did not glitter aggressively. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light, holding it quietly, as though content to remain unnoticed. Holmes placed it upon the cloth, allowing it to rest undisturbed. "The Blue Carbuncle," he said calmly. Watson leaned forward slightly, curiosity stirring, but not sharply enough to disturb the atmosphere of the room. "So this is what was lost," he said. Holmes nodded. "And what was carried," he added, without knowing. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the presence of the stone settle into the room. The firelight played gently across its surface, casting faint blue reflections that shifted slowly with the movement of the flames. "It traveled far," Holmes continued, "from hand to hand, from place to place, never calling attention to itself." Watson considered the thought. "It seems strange," he said quietly, "that something so valuable could pass unnoticed." Holmes smiled faintly. "Value," he said, "is often a matter of recognition." He leaned back, folding his hands, his gaze drifting toward the fire rather than the stone. "The man who lost it," Holmes said, "searched loudly. He demanded urgency. He created disturbance." Watson nodded slowly. "And the stone," Holmes went on, "responded by remaining silent." The room felt especially warm now, not only from the fire, but from the reassurance carried in Holmes's voice. Nothing about the moment felt dangerous or dramatic. Instead, it felt reflective, almost comforting. Holmes reached for the hat and placed it beside the stone. "These two," he said, "never belonged together, and yet they traveled the same path." Watson watched as Holmes gently returned the stone to its wrapping. "What happens next?" he asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He poured tea first, allowing the pause to stretch comfortably. "Next," he said at last. We allowed time to speak. Watson accepted the cup, the warmth grounding him. Outside, the city had grown quieter again. Snow fell softly. barely audible as it touched the streets below. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, its sound slow and unhurried. Holmes stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the winter night. "The man who lost this," he said, "will reveal more by how he searches than by what he claims." Watson sensed that the most important part of the mystery had already passed, not in action, but in understanding. The stone rested quietly. The hat lay nearby. The fire continued its steady breathing. Nothing demanded immediate resolution. Holmes returned to his chair and settled in, his posture relaxed. "For tonight," he said, "this is enough." Watson felt his own thoughts growing heavier, slower, as though gently lulled by the rhythm of the evening. The room held its silence without effort. The mystery no longer felt like a question, but like a story, gradually finding its resting place. And so Baker Street drifted into night once more, carrying with it the quiet certainty that all things, when given patience, eventually reveal themselves. The night at Baskerville passed without interruption. Snow continued to fall long after the lamps were dimmed, softening the city until even its oldest stones seemed to rest. By morning, London lay beneath a quiet white cover, untouched in places where footsteps had not yet passed. Holmes was awake early, though nothing in his manner suggested urgency. He sat by the window, watching the slow movement of clouds as they drifted across the pale winter sky. A blue carbuncle remained where he had placed it the night before, wrapped carefully and set aside, as though it were no more remarkable than any other object in the room. Watson entered some time later, the warmth of the fire greeting him at once. "You were up before the city," he observed. Holmes nodded slightly. "The city speaks differently before it stirs." He turned from the window and poured tea, the familiar ritual grounding the morning in quiet routine. The kettle's low murmur blended with the faint sounds of the street below, distant footsteps, a cart passing slowly, the muffled call of a vendor beginning his day. Watson took his seat, his gaze drifting briefly toward the small wrapped object on the table. "The stone rests easily," he said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "It has finished its journey." Watson considered this as he warmed his hands around the cup. The fire crackled softly, steady and reassuring. "The man who lost it," Holmes continued, "has not." Watson looked up, attentive but calm. "He searches," Holmes went on, "with noise rather than care. He believes urgency will bend the world in his favor." Holmes reached for a folded newspaper and spread it across the table. His finger traced a short column near the edge of the page, an announcement written in bold, insistent language. Watson leaned forward just enough to read. The notice spoke of a valuable blue stone lost, of a reward offered, of strict questions asked of those who might have come near it. The tone was sharp, almost demanding. "He wants answers quickly," Watson said. Holmes nodded. "And so he presses upon the world. But the world does not respond well to pressure." The paper was folded again and set aside. "There is another way," Holmes said, "a quieter one." The morning unfolded slowly. They did not leave at once. Holmes seemed content to wait, to let the hours arrange themselves naturally. The city outside grew gradually louder, though even at its busiest, winter kept its volume low. Late in the morning, a knock came at the door. It was firm, but not impatient. Holmes rose and opened it without haste. A man stood in the doorway, his posture upright, but strained. His clothing was well made, though worn by recent worry rather than age. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the room as though seeking reassurance, and finding none. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, "I was told you might be able to help me." Holmes stepped aside, inviting him in. The man removed his hat and held it tightly in his hands. turning it without realizing he was doing so. His movements betrayed a mind that would not settle. "I have lost something of great importance," the man said. Holmes gestured to the chair opposite Watson. "Please," he said gently, "sit." The man obeyed, though he did not relax. His gaze darted toward the table, lingering briefly before moving on. Holmes listened as the man spoke, of confusion, of accusation, of how events had unfolded too quickly to follow. He spoke of servants questioned, of strangers suspected, of the unfairness of chance. Holmes did not interrupt. He allowed the man's words to flow naturally until they faded into silence. "You have been searching loudly," Holmes said at last. The man stiffened slightly. "I had no choice." Holmes tilted his head. "There is always a choice, but not all of them feel comfortable." The man exhaled, his shoulders lowering just a fraction. "I wanted it found," he said quietly. "And it has been," Holmes replied. The man looked up sharply, his eyes wide with sudden hope. Holmes did not rush to the table. He did not produce the stone at once. Instead, he spoke calmly. "Before we return what was lost," he said, "we must understand how it came to be lost." The man listened, though his fingers tightened around his hat. Holmes spoke of the goose, of the market, of how objects sometimes travel without intention. He described the journey not as a mistake, but as a sequence of ordinary events, none of them cruel, none careless enough to deserve blame. As Holmes spoke, the man's breathing slowed. "I accused someone unfairly," the man said at last, his voice lower now. Holmes nodded. As often the cost of haste. Silence settled briefly in the room, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Holmes then reached for the wrapped stone and placed it gently on the table. The man stared at it, his eyes softening, relief replacing tension. "It was never lost forever," Holmes said, "only misplaced for a time." The man nodded slowly. His expression changed. "Thank you," he said quietly and sincerely. Holmes inclined his head. "When the world seems loud," he said, "it is often best to listen more carefully." The man departed soon after, his steps lighter than when he had arrived. Watson watched the door close behind him. "You showed him more than he asked for," Watson said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Sometimes," he replied, "that is the true solution." The fire continued to burn steadily. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that a small imbalance had been quietly corrected. After the door closed behind their visitor, Baker Street returned to its familiar stillness, as though the interruption had never occurred. The fire continued its slow, steady breathing, and the lamplight rested gently upon the walls, untroubled by the events that had just passed. Holmes remained standing for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair where the man had sat. His expression was thoughtful, but not burdened. Watson watched him quietly. "The room feels lighter," Watson said at last. Holmes nodded. Unburdened objects often leave behind unburdened spaces. He returned to his chair and settled in, the movement unhurried, deliberate. The Blue Carbuncle was no longer on the table. Its absence felt natural, as though it had never truly belonged there in the first place. Watson leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire seep into his limbs. Outside, the city resumed its winter rhythm, measured footsteps, distant voices, the occasional passing of a carriage. None of it intruded. "The man will sleep better tonight," Watson observed. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and so will those he accused." Watson considered this quietly. The idea that resolution could arrive without punishment or drama felt oddly reassuring. Holmes reached for his violin, but did not lift it. Instead, he rested his fingers lightly against the polished wood, as if acknowledging it without intention to play. "Not every mystery requires consequence," he said. Some only require understanding. The afternoon passed gently. Holmes and Watson spoke little, and when they did, their words were slow and unhurried. Tea was poured. A log was added to the fire. The clock marked the passing hours without insistence. Outside, the light began its gradual retreat, fading not abruptly, but in soft layers. Shadows lengthened, then settled, and the windows once again reflected the quiet interior of the room. Watson rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the street below. Snow had been disturbed by passing feet, but fresh flakes had already begun to smooth the surface once more. "London seems content," he said. "It often is," Holmes replied, when left to its own rhythm. As evening approached, the familiar comfort of routine returned fully. Holmes prepared a simple meal, and they ate without ceremony, the sounds of cutlery and quiet conversation blending easily into the background of the room. When the dishes were cleared away, Holmes returned to his chair and finally lifted the violin. He drew the bow slowly across the strings, producing a sound so gentle it felt more like a continuation of silence than a departure from it. The melody was unhurried, repetitive, soothing. It wandered without direction, then circled back upon itself, content to exist without destination. Watson closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound wash over him. The music filled the room, not by volume, but by presence. Each note arrived softly, lingered briefly, and then gave way to the next, as though aware that nothing needed to be rushed. When Holmes set the violin aside, the silence that followed felt complete rather than empty. "There are nights," Holmes said quietly, "when nothing more needs to be done." Watson nodded. The fire burned lower now. Its glow burned steadier. Shadows shifted slowly along the walls, responding only to the smallest movements of flame. Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed, his thoughts unspoken. "The stone has returned to its place," he said, "and the city has returned to itself." Watson felt a deep sense of calm settle over him. The events of the past days no longer felt like a mystery resolved, but like a story gently folded and set aside. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and persistent, muffling the city into quiet agreement. Baker Street rested once more in balance, and within its walls, nothing remained to be discovered, only the gentle comfort of knowing that, for now, all was as it should be. Night settled over Baker Street in layers rather than moments. The sounds of the city softened first, then slowly withdrew, leaving only the most distant reminders of movement beyond the windows. A carriage passed now and then, its wheels muted by snow. Somewhere far away, a bell marked the hour, its tone low and unhurried. Inside the sitting room, fire had been allowed to sink into a steady glow. There were no tall flames now, only embers, breathing softly, casting a gentle warmth that asked nothing more than patience. Holmes sat in his chair, still and composed, his gaze resting not on any particular object, but on the space between them. Watson reclined opposite him, his book unopened on his lap, forgotten without regret. Neither felt the need to speak. Silence had taken on a shape of its own, familiar and reassuring. It did not press upon them. It simply existed, as natural as the ticking of the clock or the faint sigh of the buildings settling into the cold. Holmes shifted slightly, reaching to adjust a log in the hearth. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Sparks glowed briefly, then settled again. "Some nights," Holmes said quietly, "are meant to remain undisturbed." Watson nodded, though his eyes were already half closed. The clock marked another hour. Its sound was not sharp, but rounded, softened by distance and the surrounding quiet. Each chime arrived gently, then faded without echo. Holmes leaned back, folding his hands, allowing his thoughts to drift without direction. The urgency that so often accompanied his work was absent now, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that required no explanation. "The city sleeps," he murmured. "And so should we," Watson replied softly. Holmes smiled faintly, though the expression passed quickly, leaving only calm behind. Outside, snow continued its patient descent. It fell without sound, covering the marks of the day, smoothing edges, filling spaces. The streets below grew brighter in a lamplight, reflecting a pale, steady glow. Watson's breathing slowed, deepened, aligning itself naturally with the rhythm of the room. The fire responded with a soft crackle, as though in agreement. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment, listening, not for danger, not for disturbance, but for reassurance in the ordinary sounds that surrounded him. The faint hiss of embers, the slow tick of the clock, the distant murmur of London resting. His thoughts wandered briefly to past winters, to other quiet nights that had followed a resolution of small human mysteries. He recalled moments not of triumph, but of stillness, moments when nothing more was required of him. He found comfort there. Watson shifted slightly in his chair, the movement barely noticeable. Holmes opened his eyes, glancing toward his friend with quiet acknowledgement, then returned his gaze to the fire. "There will always be another question," Holmes said softly, "another problem." Watson murmured in response, though his words were indistinct, already dissolving into sleep. "But not tonight," Holmes continued. "Tonight is complete." The room seemed to settle even further at those words, as though acknowledging their truth. Holmes allowed his thoughts to slow, to loosen, to drift. The night asked nothing of him. It offered only rest. The fire dimmed slightly, its glow deepening into rich amber tones. Shadows moved lazily across the walls, their motion so slow it was almost imperceptible. Outside, the city held its breath. And within the quiet rooms of Baker Street, the long night unfolded without disturbance, carrying with it the simple assurance that all was well, and that sleep, unforced and unhurried, would come when it was ready. The night deepened without effort. There was no clear moment when evening became true night. It happened gradually, in the same way a fire lowered itself from flame to ember, or how breath slows when the body finally lets go for the day. Baker Street rested. The rooms were dim now, illuminated only by the quiet glow of the hearth and a single lamp turned low. Shadows gathered in familiar places, beneath the chairs, along the shelves, in the corners where the light preferred not to linger. Holmes remained seated, unmoving, his posture relaxed in a way few would ever notice. His hands rested loosely together, his shoulders eased, his breathing slow and even. Across from him, Watson slept, not deeply at first, only the light, drifting sleep that comes before true rest. His book had slipped closed, his head resting comfortably against the back of the chair. Each breath rose and fell gently, in time with the steady warmth of the room. Holmes listened, not for trouble, not for footsteps, only for reassurance in the ordinary. The clock continued its quiet work, marking time without urgency. Its sound was rounded and distant, as though muffled by layers of calm. Outside, the snow softened the city further. Roof lines blurred, street sounds faded, even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness, moving only when necessary, then retreating again. Holmes allowed his thoughts to wander without direction. There was no case before him now, no puzzle to hold tightly. Only the quiet satisfaction of balance restored, of things returned gently to where they belonged. The Blue Carbuncle was gone, the hat had been returned, the city had resumed its slow winter rhythm. Nothing remained unresolved. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, not because he needed to remain alert, but because he enjoyed the way the firelight shifted when he did. The glow rose and fell slowly, like a living thing breathing in rest. The fire made a soft sound as a log settled. Holmes adjusted it slightly, then withdrew his hand, leaving the embers to find their own comfort. He leaned back. The chair welcomed him without complaint. The room felt held together by quiet agreements between light and shadow, warmth and cold, sound and silence. Everything knew its place. Watson stirred faintly, then grew still again. Holmes smiled almost imperceptibly. The night stretched on, unmeasured. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. It did not matter. The city outside breathed slowly now. Each building seemed to exhale warmth into the cold air, then draw stillness back in. Snow continued to fall, covering yesterday, softening edges, forgiving footprints. Holmes thought briefly of other nights like this, nights and nothing asked to be solved, when the world simply existed, complete in its quiet. He welcomed the thought. The clock chimed, marking another hour. The sound faded quickly, absorbed by the room, leaving no echo behind. Holmes did not count the hours. He allowed himself to sink deeper into stillness, his awareness broad but gentle, like a candle turned low rather than extinguished. The fire dimmed further. The lamp cast a smaller circle of light. The rest of the room settled into shadow, content and undisturbed. Outside, London slept. Inside, Baker Street held its peace. And within that peace, there was nothing more to do, nothing more to consider, only the slow, steady unfolding of rest, carrying the night forward exactly as it should. The night continued, unbroken and unhurried. Time no longer moved in steps or segments. It flowed instead, smooth and continuous, like water beneath ice, present, steady, and unconcerned with measurement. In the sitting room at Baker Street, the fire had reached its quietest state. The embers glowed low and deep, offering warmth without flame, light without movement. Their soft color shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, responding to nothing more than the natural rhythm of cooling and renewal. Holmes remained in his chair, resting comfortably within the stillness. His breathing was slow and even, rising and falling without effort. His thoughts, once sharp and deliberate, now drifted freely, untethered from purpose. Across the room, Watson slept more deeply now. His posture had softened further, his features relaxed, his breath steady and calm. Sleep had found him fully and gently, without struggle. The clock continued its quiet vigil. Each tick was subtle, rounded by distance, and absorbed by the room. It marked the passing of moments, without asking anyone to notice. Even when the hour arrived and the clock chimed, the sound was muted, softened by walls, by snow, by rest. Outside, the city lay still. Snow rested where it had fallen, blanketing rooftops and streets alike. The lamps cast pale halos onto the white ground, their light steady and reassuring. Nothing hurried beneath them. Nothing disturbed the quiet order of the night. Faint wind moved through the street, brushing against corners and doorways, then passing on. It carried no message, no warning, only the reassurance that the world continued, quietly and reliably. Holmes shifted slightly in his chair, not waking, not sleeping fully, simply adjusting as one does when comfort deepens. The leather responded with a soft sound, then fell silent again. The room accepted the movement without change. Books lined the shelves, undisturbed. Papers rested where they had been left, their edges softened by shadow. The familiar shapes of the room felt less like objects now, and more like companions, present, steady, and known. The fire released a quiet sigh as a final ember settled. Holmes' thoughts drifted again, touching briefly on memories, without lingering, other winters, other nights. Moments when stillness followed resolution, when the world seemed balanced, if only for a time. He did not analyze these thoughts. He allowed them to pass. Watson's breathing deepened further, settling into a rhythm that matched the room itself. Each inhale was slow, each exhale longer. The space between breaths widened comfortably, like pauses in music that needed no sound to feel complete. The clock marked another hour. No one counted it. No one needed to. The night seemed expansive now, stretching gently in all directions. It did not press forward. It did not recede. It simply was. Holmes's eyes remained closed. His awareness dimmed slightly, then steadied, like a lamp turned low but not extinguished. He rested within the quiet, without surrendering to it completely, content to hover at the edge of sleep. Outside, snow continued its patient work, smoothing the city further, softening edges, forgiving the traces of the day. Footsteps from earlier had vanished. Marks of movement were gone. The world felt new again, untouched. A distant sound, perhaps a late carriage, perhaps only the wind, passed briefly through the night and faded. It left no disturbance behind. The room remained unchanged. Warmth lingered. Silence held. Time moved on, unnoticed and unremarked. And in the gentle passing of hours, Baker Street rested, secure in the knowledge that nothing more was required, and that the night would carry everything forward exactly as it should. The night remained, not as something active or watchful, but as a wide open quiet that asked nothing of the world it held. In the rooms at Baker Street, there was no change worth marking. The fire rested in its final, comfortable state, embers glowing low, releasing warmth slowly, evenly, as though mindful not to wake anyone. The lamp burned dimly, its light contained, its reach modest and sufficient. Holmes sat in the same position as before, his body at ease, his breathing slow and steady. There was no tension in his posture, no readiness required. He occupied the room gently, as one might occupy a familiar thought, without effort. Watson slept on. His breathing moved in a calm pattern, repeating itself without variation. Each breath followed the last naturally, with no pause sharp enough to notice, no rhythm strict enough to demand attention. Sleep had settled fully, comfortably, and without resistance. The clock continued to mark time. Its ticking was so soft now, it felt more like a presence than a sound. Even the spaces between each movement seemed to stretch, widening gently, allowing time itself to slow. Outside, the city lay beneath its quiet covering of snow. Streets reflected lamplight faintly, their surfaces smooth and undisturbed. The buildings stood patiently, holding warmth inside, letting cold pass harmlessly around them. Nothing moved quickly. Nothing needed to. A faint breeze drifted through the street, brushing against windows, then continuing on. It carried no urgency, no message, only the soft reminder that air still moved, that the world still breathed. Inside, the room remained unchanged. The shelves held their books, the chairs held their shapes, the floor held the warmth gathered throughout the evening. Even the shadows seemed settled, resting where they had fallen, content not to shift. Holmes' thoughts moved slowly now, more like impressions than ideas. They drifted without direction, touching briefly on memories, sensations, fragments of earlier days. None of them stayed long enough to require attention. He did not follow them. He allowed them to pass. The space between breaths widened gently. Each inhale arrived easily. Each exhale lingered a little longer, as though savoring the quiet. Watson stirred faintly, then grew still again. The movement was small, instinctive, the kind that deep sleep allows. Without waking, the room accepted it, without change. The embers dimmed slightly, then held. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. Time no longer felt like something passing. It felt like something resting. Outside, snow continued to fall in slow, patient patterns. Each flake descended without sound, joining those already at rest. Together they softened the world, smoothing edges, quieting memory, forgiving motion. The city beneath the snow felt distant, dreamlike, as though it existed somewhere just beyond awareness. Inside Baker Street, awareness itself grew softer. The room seemed to breathe, warmth expanding gently, then settling back. Light deepened, then steadied. Silence grew fuller, not emptier. Holmes remained still. Watson remained asleep. Nothing required adjustment. Nothing required thought. The night carried everything forward without effort, holding each moment lightly, allowing it to fade naturally into the next. And in that steady, unbroken calm, the hours continued to pass, unnoticed, unmeasured, and perfectly at ease. The night continued to hold Baker Street in its quiet care. There was no sense of movement now, no clear division between one hour and the next. Time had loosened its structure, allowing moments to blend softly together, like shadows merging along the walls. Inside the sitting room, warmth lingered. Not the sharp warmth of flame, but the settled warmth that remains after effort has ended. The embers in the hearth glowed faintly, their color eat and calm, offering reassurance rather than light. They required nothing. They simply remained. The lamp burned low. Its light was no longer bright enough to define details clearly. Instead, it softened edges, rounded corners, and invited the room to rest in half shadow. Familiar shapes became gentler versions of themselves, less precise, more comforting. Holmes sat quietly. His breathing was slow and even, each breath arriving without effort and leaving just as gently. There was no tension in his body, no readiness in his posture. He was not waiting. He was simply present. Across the room, Watson slept deeply. His breathing followed a steady rhythm, calm and unbroken. His features were relaxed, untroubled by thought or memory. Sleep had settled fully, wrapping him in a quiet that asked nothing in return. The clock continued its soft work. Its ticking was faint now, nearly indistinguishable from the silence around it. Each movement blended seamlessly into the space, marking time without asserting it. Even when the hour passed, the sound was distant and rounded, as though softened and by layers of rest. Outside, the city lay beneath snow and night. The streets were smooth and pale, reflecting lamplight in soft, unfocused pools. The buildings stood quietly, their windows dark or dim, holding warmth inside and letting the cold pass gently around them. Nothing hurried, nothing intruded. A faint breeze moved through the street, brushing lightly against stone and glass. Before drifting on, it made no sound worth noticing. It left no trace behind. Inside, the room remained unchanged. The shelves stood patient. The chairs rested. The floor held the warmth gathered through the evening. Shadows lay where they had fallen, content to remain still. Light moved only slightly, responding to the quiet breathing of the room. Holmes's thoughts were no longer thoughts in any structured sense. They were impressions, soft, unfocused, passing gently through awareness without lingering, a sense of warmth, a memory of winter light, the feeling of stillness after completion. None of them required attention. He allowed them to come and go. The space between breaths widened slightly. Each inhale arrived calmly. Each exhale lingered, stretching gently into the silence before fading. The fire released a faint sound as an ember settled, then returned to stillness. Watson shifted once, barely perceptible, then relaxed again. The movement was instinctive, the kind that deep rest allows without disturbance. The room accepted it easily. Time passed. Or perhaps it rested. The difference no longer mattered. Outside, snow continued its patient descent. Each flake fell without sound, joining those already at rest. Together, they softened the city further, smoothing edges, quieting memory, erasing the signs of the day. The city beneath the snow felt distant now, like something remembered rather than observed. Inside Baker Street, awareness softened further. The room seems to breathe, warmth expanding gently, then settling back. Silence deepened, not by absence, but by fullness. It became a presence of its own, steady and reassuring. Holmes remained still. Watson remained asleep. Nothing needed to be done. Nothing needed to be remembered. The night held everything gently, asking nothing, offering rest without condition. Moments drifted past without leaving marks. They arrived quietly and departed just as softly, blending into one another until distinction no longer mattered. The clock continued its quiet vigil, though no one noticed. The lamp burned steadily, content to remain low. The embers glowed faintly, holding warmth without flame. Outside, the city rested. Inside, Baker Street remained at ease. And within that ease, sleep deepened naturally, supported by the steady rhythm of breath, the soft presence of warmth, and the unbroken calm of a night that knew exactly how to hold everything without effort. The night remained exactly as it was, not still in a way that felt empty, but still in a way that felt complete. Inside the rooms at Baker Street, nothing asked for attention. Nothing called out to be noticed. The quiet held its place gently, like a blanket resting without weight. The fire had settled into its final warmth. No flame remained, only embers, glowing low and steady, releasing heat slowly, evenly, without sound. Their light was deep and muted, barely touching the edges of the room. The lamp burned low. Its glow was constant, unchanging, soft enough that the room existed more in suggestion and detail. Corners blurred gently, lines softened, familiar shapes rested without definition. Holmes sat where he had been for hours now. His posture was easy, unguarded, supported fully by the chair. His breathing followed a slow, natural rhythm, unforced, uncounted, effortless. Each breath arrived calmly and departed just as gently, leaving behind nothing but quiet. Across the room, Watson slept, not lightly, not fitfully, but deeply, completely. His breathing was steady and calm, each breath flowing into the next without pause or effort. Sleep had wrapped around him fully, holding him in a place where thoughts no longer formed and time no longer mattered. The clock continued its soft presence. Its ticking was faint, almost indistinguishable from the silence that surrounded it. Even the passing of the hour made no impression. The sound rose gently, then faded, leaving the room unchanged. Outside, the city rested beneath snow and darkness, Streets lay smooth and pale. Footprints had disappeared beneath fresh layers of quiet. Lamplight pooled softly on the ground, steady and reassuring, never flickering, never intruding. Buildings stood patiently, holding warmth inside, releasing nothing but stillness to the night air. A faint breeze moved occasionally through the street, brushing against stone and glass before drifting on. It carried no sound worth noticing, no movement sharp enough to disturb. Inside, the room accepted everything as it was. The shelves stood unmoving. The chairs remained exactly where they were. The floor held warmth gathered long ago. Shadows rested comfortably in place, content not to shift. Light remained gentle, constant, and calm. Holmes's awareness softened further. Thoughts no longer formed in words or images. Instead, there was only a sense of presence, of being held within warmth, quiet, and rest. Nothing pressed forward, nothing pulled back. There was no urgency, no memory, no expectation. Only the steady rhythm of breathing. Inhale, exhale, each breath slower than the last, each pause longer, wider, more comfortable. The fire released a barely audible sound as an ember settled deeper into ash, then became still again. Watson shifted once, a small, instinctive movement that deep sleep allows. His body adjusted, then relaxed further, sinking back into rest. The room responded with quiet acceptance. Time passed, or perhaps it rested too. The difference no longer existed. Outside, snow continued its slow descent, falling without sound, without destination, without concern. Each flake joined those already at rest, smoothing the world further, softening every edge. The city beneath the snow felt distant now, like something remembered faintly, without detail or weight. Inside Baker Street, awareness dimmed further. The room seemed to breathe, warmth expanding gently, then settling back again. Silence deepened, not by becoming emptier, but by becoming fuller. Holmes remained still. Watson remained asleep. Nothing needed to change, nothing needed to be held onto. The night carried everything forward without effort, holding each moment lightly, allowing it to fade naturally into the next. There was no beginning here, no ending, only continuation. The clock remained, the lamp remained, the embers remained. Outside, the city slept. Inside, Baker Street arrested. And within that quiet, sleep continued, deep, unbroken, and secure, supported by the steady rhythm of breath, the gentle presence of warmth, and the unchanging calm of a night that knew exactly how to remain. The night remained steady, not still in a way that suggested waiting, and not quiet in the way that felt empty, but steady, complete, and settled, as though everything had already arrived exactly where it belonged. Inside the rooms at Baker Street, nothing shifted with intention, nothing moved with purpose. The space existed comfortably within itself, held together by warmth, shadow, and the soft rhythm of breathing. The embers in the hearth continued to glow. They no longer brightened or dimmed in noticeable ways. Their warmth was constant, even, reliable. It spread gently through the room, touching surfaces lightly, asking nothing in return. The lamp remained low. Its light did not reach far. It did not need to. It offered just enough glow to soften the darkness without interrupting it. Corners remained indistinct. Shapes blended quietly into one another. Holmes sat as he had for hours now. His posture was relaxed, supported, unguarded. His breathing followed a slow, natural pattern, deep, even, unforced. Each breath arrived quietly and departed just as gently, leaving behind only a sense of ease. Across the room, Watson slept on. His rest was deep and unbroken. His body had found a position of comfort and remained there without effort. His breathing was steady, calm, and slow, flowing naturally from one breath to the next. The clock continued its quiet presence. Its ticking was so soft it felt more like a suggestion than a sound. Even when the hour passed, the chime rose gently and faded quickly, leaving no trace behind. Outside, the city rested beneath snow and darkness. The streets lay smooth and pale, softened by layers of quiet. Lamplight pooled gently on the ground, steady and warm, never flickering, never demanding attention. Buildings stood patient and still, holding warmth inside and releasing nothing but calm into the cold air. A faint breeze moved occasionally, brushing against stone and glass, then drifting on. It carried no urgency, no message, only the quiet reassurance that the world continued. Inside, the room accepted everything as it was. The shelves remained steady, the chairs held their shapes, the floor retained the warmth gathered long ago. Shadows rested where they had settled, content not to move. Light remained gentle and consistent, offering comfort rather than clarity. Holmes's awareness softened further. There were no thoughts now, only sensation, warmth, stillness, the gentle rise and fall of breath. Awareness existed without direction, without need, without form. Inhale, exhale, each breath slow, each pause wide and comfortable. Watson stirred faintly once, a small instinctive adjustment, then grew still again. Sleep held him easily, without resistance. The room did not respond. It did not need to. Time continued, or perhaps it rested too. There was no difference now. Outside, snow continued to fall, flake after flake, each one descending without sound, without destination, without urgency. Together, they softened the world further, smoothing edges, erasing memory of movement. The city beneath the snow felt distant, almost dreamlike, present, but not demanding awareness. Inside Baker Street, awareness dimmed gently. The room seemed to breathe, warmth expanding slowly, then settling back. Silence deepened, not by absence, but by fullness. Everything remained. Nothing changed. Holmes remained still. Watson remained asleep. The clock remained. The lamp remained. The embers remained. The night carried on, holding each moment lightly, allowing it to fade naturally into the next, without distinction. There was no beginning here, no ending, only continuation. Breath followed breath. Warmth followed warmth. Quiet followed quiet. And within that steady rhythm, the rhythm that did not change, sleep continued, deep and secure, supported by repetition, by stillness, and by the calm assurance that nothing would interrupt the night. The night remained exactly as it was, not paused, not waiting, simply continuing. Inside the rooms at Baker Street, there was no signal that time had moved forward, no sound marked a beginning. No change announced itself. Everything rested within the same calm arrangement, held gently in place. The embers in the hearth glowed quietly. They no longer shifted or settled in noticeable ways, for their warmth spread evenly through the room, touching the furniture, the walls, the air itself. It was not a warmth that demanded attention. It was a warmth that reassured by its consistency. The lamp remained low. Its light was soft and contained, never bright enough to define edges clearly. The room existed in gentle suggestion, shapes known rather than seen, shadows resting where they belonged. Holmes sat comfortably in his chair. His posture had not changed, though comfort had deepened. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands resting loosely, his breathing slow and natural. Each breath arrived quietly and left without effort. Across the room, Watson continued to sleep. His rest was deep and unbroken. His breathing followed a steady rhythm, calm and even, flowing from one breath to the next without pause. His body had settled fully into stillness, supported easily by the chair beneath him. The clock continued its soft presence. Its ticking blended into the quiet so completely it felt like part of the silence itself. Even when the hour passed, the sound rose gently and faded before it could register as anything more than a distant reassurance. Outside, the city rested beneath snow and darkness. The streets lay smooth and pale, softened by layers of quiet. Lamplight pooled gently along the ground, steady and warm, offering comfort without brightness. Bilton stood patient and unmoving, holding warmth inside and releasing nothing but stillness to the cold air. A faint breeze moved occasionally through the street, brushing lightly against stone and glass before drifting on. It carried no urgency, no sound worth noticing, only the quiet continuation of air in motion. Inside, the room accepted everything as it was. The shelves stood quietly, the chairs remained steady, the floor retained its warmth, shadows lay comfortably in place, content not to shift. Light remained unchanged, offering calm rather than clarity. Holmes' awareness softened further. There were no thoughts now, no images, no memories, no questions. Only sensation remained: warmth, stillness, the gentle rhythm of breath. Inhale, exhale, each breath slow and unforced, each pause wide and comfortable. The fire made no sound. The lamp did not flicker. The room remained perfectly content. Watson stirred once, very slightly, then settled again. The movement was instinctive and brief, the kind that deep sleep allows without waking. His breathing soon returned to its steady rhythm. The room did not respond. It did not need to. Time passed. Or perhaps it rested too. The distinction no longer mattered. Outside, snow continued its slow descent, flake after flake, each one falling without sound, without destination, without concern. Together they softened the world further, smoothing edges, quieting memory. The city beneath the snow felt distant now, almost unreal, present only as a quiet suggestion beyond the windows. Inside Baker Street, awareness dimmed further. The room seemed to breathe, warmth expanding gently, then settling back again. Silence deepened, not by becoming emptier, but by becoming fuller. Everything remained, nothing changed. The clock continued, the lamp continued, the embers continued. Holmes remained still. Watson remained asleep. The night carried on, holding each moment lightly, allowing it to dissolve naturally into the next, without distinction or boundary. There was no beginning here, no ending, only continuation. Breath followed breath, warmth followed warmth, quiet followed quiet. And within that steady, unchanging rhythm, sleep remained deep and secure, supported by repetition, by stillness, and by the calm assurance that nothing would interrupt the night. The night continued without announcement. There was no moment when one hour ended and another began. Time moved softly now, without edges, without markers. It flowed in a way that required no attention and offered no urgency. Inside the rooms at Baker Street, everything remained as it had been. The embers in the hearth glowed steadily, their warmth even and reliable. They did not brighten, they did not fade. They simply remained, releasing comfort into the air at a gentle, unchanging pace. The lamp stayed low. Its light was contained and calm, just enough to soften the darkness without interrupting it. Shapes rested in half shadow, familiar but undefined, known without needing to be seen. Holmes remained seated in quiet comfort. His body was fully at ease now, supported without effort by the chair. His breathing followed a slow, natural rhythm, deep, even, unforced. Each breath arrived quietly and departed just as gently, leaving behind only calm. Across the room, Watson slept on. His rest was deep and steady, untouched by thought or dream. His breathing moved in a smooth pattern, each breath flowing into the next without pause. Sleep held him easily, without resistance. The clock continued its subtle presence. Its ticking blended completely into the silence around it. Even when the hour passed, the sound was so soft it felt more like a memory than a noise. Outside, the city rested beneath snow and night. The streets lay pale and smooth, softened by layers of quiet. Lamplight pooled gently along the ground, steady and warm, offering reassurance without brightness. Buildings stood patiently, holding warmth inside, releasing nothing but stillness into the cold air. A faint breeze moved now and then, brushing lightly against stone and glass, before drifting on. It carried no message, no urgency, only the quiet continuation of air in motion. Inside, the room accepted everything as it was. The shelves stood quietly, the chairs remained steady, the floor held its warmth. Shadows lay comfortably where they had settled, content not to move. Light remained gentle and unchanged. Holmes' awareness softened further. There were no thoughts now, no images, no memories. Only sensation remained, the warmth of the room, the stillness of the night, the gentle rhythm of breath. Inhale, exhale, each breath slow and comfortable, each pause wide and easy. The fire made no sound, the lamp did not flicker. The room remained perfectly content. Watson shifted once, a small instinctive movement, then relaxed again. His breathing returned immediately to its steady rhythm. Sleep continued without interruption. The room did not respond. It did not need to. Time passed, or perhaps it rested too. The difference had dissolved. Outside, snow continued to fall, flake after flake, each one descending without sound, without urgency, without destination. Together, they softened the world further, smoothing edges, erasing the traces of movement. The city beneath the snow felt distant now, almost unreal, present only as a gentle suggestion beyond the windows. Inside Baker Street, awareness dimmed further. The room seemed to breathe, warmth expanding gently, then settling back again. Silence deepened, not by absence, but by fullness. Everything remained, nothing changed. The clock continued. The lamp continued. The embers continued. Holmes remained still. Watson remained asleep. The night carried on, holding each moment lightly, allowing it to dissolve naturally into the next. Without boundary or distinction, there was no beginning here, no ending, only continuation. Breath followed breath, warmth followed warmth, quiet followed quiet. And within that steady, unchanging rhythm, sleep remained deep and secure, supported by repetition, by stillness, and by the calm assurance that nothing would disturb the night. The night continued, not forward, not backward, simply onward, in the same calm shape it had held for hours. There was no signal that anything needed to change. No sound rose to announce a shift. No movement suggested a beginning or an ending. The quiet remained exactly as it was, complete and undisturbed. Inside the rooms at Baker Street, warmth lingered gently. The embers in a hearth glowed low and steady, their heat even and reassuring. They did not flicker, they did not settle further. They remained, releasing comfort into the air at a pace that never varied. The lamp remained low. Its soft glow reached only as far as necessary, touching nearby surfaces lightly and leaving the rest of the room in comfortable shadow. Edges softened, corners blurred. The room existed in suggestion rather than detail. Holmes sat in the same position as before. His posture was fully relaxed, supported without effort. His breathing moved slowly and evenly, each breath arriving quietly and leaving just as gently. There was no tension in his body, no readiness required. Across the room, Watson slept on. His rest was deep and continuous. His breathing followed a steady rhythm, calm and unbroken. Each breath flowed naturally into the next, with no pause sharp enough to notice. The clock continued its quiet presence. Its ticking blended seamlessly into the silence around it, becoming part of the background rather than standing apart. Even when the hour passed, the sound rose softly and faded before it could demand attention. Outside, the city rested beneath snow and darkness. The streets lay smooth and pale, softened by layers of quiet. Lamplight pooled gently on the ground, steady and warm, never flickering, never intruding. Buildings stood patiently, holding warmth inside and releasing nothing but stillness into the cold air. A faint breeze moved now and then, brushing lightly against stone and glass before drifting on. It carried no message, no urgency, only the quiet continuation of air in motion. Inside, the room accepted everything as it was. The shelves remained steady. The chairs held their shapes. The floor retained its warmth. Shadows rested comfortably where they had settled, content not to move. Light remained gentle and unchanged. Holmes' awareness softened further. There were no thoughts now, no memories, no images. Only sensation remained. The warmth of the room, the stillness of the night, the gentle rhythm of breath. Inhale, exhale, each breath slow and effortless, each pause wide and comfortable. The fire made no sound. The lamp did not flicker. The room remained perfectly content. Watson stirred once, very slightly, then settled again. The movement was instinctive, brief, and immediately followed by stillness. Sleep continued without interruption. The room did not respond. It did not need to. Time passed. Or perhaps it rested too. The distinction had dissolved completely. Outside, snow continued to fall, flake after flake, each one descending without sound, without destination, without concern. They softened the world further, smoothing edges, erasing traces of movement. The city beneath the snow felt distant now, almost unreal, present only as a quiet suggestion beyond the windows. Inside Baker Street, awareness dimmed gently. The room seemed to breathe, warmth expanding slowly, then settling back again. Silence deepened, not by absence, but by fullness. Everything remained. Nothing changed. The clock continued. The lamp continued. The embers continued. Holmes remained still. Watson remained asleep. The night carried on, holding each moment lightly, allowing it to dissolve naturally into the next, without boundary or distinction. There was no beginning here, no ending, only continuation. Breath followed breath, warmth followed warmth, quiet followed quiet. And within that steady, unchanging rhythm, sleep remained deep and secure, supported by repetition, by stillness, and by the calm assurance that nothing would disturb the night. The night remained, not as something that moved forward or faded away, but as something that simply existed, steady, complete, and untroubled by time. Inside the rooms at Baker Street, nothing announced itself. No sound rose to claim attention. No movement suggested change. Everything rested in the same calm arrangement, held gently by warmth and shadow. The embers in the hearth glowed softly. Their warmth was even and reliable, spreading slowly through the room without variation. They did not brighten, they did not fade. They remained exactly as they were, offering comfort without asking anything in return. The lamp stayed low. Its light was contained and gentle, just enough to soften the darkness without interrupting it. Shapes blended into one another, familiar but undefined, resting comfortably in half shadow. Holmes sat where he had been for hours. His posture was fully relaxed, supported without effort. His breathing followed a slow, natural rhythm, deep, even, and unforced. Each breath arrived quietly and departed just as gently, leaving behind only calm. Across the room, Watson slept on. His rest was deep and uninterrupted. His breathing was steady and smooth, flowing from one breath to the next, without pause. Sleep held him easily, without resistance or movement. The clock continued its subtle presence. Its ticking blended completely into the surrounding silence, becoming part of the background rather than standing apart. Even when the hour passed, the sound was soft and rounded, fading before it could be noticed. Outside, the city rested beneath snow and darkness. The streets lay smooth and pale, softened by layers of quiet. Lamplight pooled gently along the ground, steady and warm, never flickering, never intruding. Buildings stood patiently, holding warmth inside, and releasing nothing but stillness into the cold air. A faint breeze moved occasionally through the street, brushing lightly against stone and glass before drifting on. It carried no urgency, no message, only the quiet continuation of air in motion. Inside, the room accepted everything as it was. The shelves stood quietly, the chairs remained steady, the floor retained its warmth. Shadows rested comfortably where they had settled, content not to move. Light remained gentle and unchanged. Holmes's awareness softened further. There were no thoughts now, no images, no memories. Only sensation remained, the warmth of the room, the stillness of the night, the gentle rhythm of breath. Inhale, exhale, each breath slow and effortless, each pause wide and comfortable. The fire made no sound, the lamp did not flicker. The room remained perfectly content. Watson stirred once, barely perceptible, then settled again. The movement was instinctive and brief, followed immediately by stillness. Sleep continued without interruption. The room did not respond. It did not need to. Time passed, or perhaps it rested too. The distinction no longer existed. Outside, snow continued its slow descent, flake after flake, each one falling without sound, without destination, without concern. Together, they softened the world further, smoothing edges, erasing traces of movement. The city beneath the snow felt distant now, almost unreal, present only as a gentle suggestion beyond the windows. Inside Baker Street, awareness dimmed gently. The room seemed to breathe, warmth expanding slowly, then settling back again. Silence deepened, not by absence, but by fullness. Everything remained, nothing changed. The clock continued, the lamp continued, the embers continued. Holmes remained still, Watson remained asleep. The night carried on, holding each moment lightly, allowing it to dissolve naturally into the next, without boundary or distinction. There was no beginning here, no ending, only continuation. Breath followed breath, warmth followed warmth, quiet followed quiet. And within that steady, unbroken calm, sleep remained deep and secure, supported by repetition, by stillness, and by the quiet certainty that the night would remain exactly as it was. The night continued, not as something moving toward morning, and not as something waiting to end, but as something complete in itself, steady and whole, resting comfortably in its own quiet. Inside the rooms at Baker Street, nothing shifted with intention, nothing changed with purpose. The space remained exactly as it had been, settled gently into warmth and shadow. The embers in the hearth glowed low and constant. Their warmth was even and reliable, spreading softly through the room, touching the furniture, the walls, the air itself. They neither brightened nor dimmed. They simply remained, offering comfort without variation. The lamp stayed low. Its light was soft and contained, just enough to soften the darkness without interrupting it. Shapes blended gently together, familiar but undefined, resting without edges. Holmes sat quietly in his chair. His posture was relaxed and unguarded, supported fully without effort. His breathing moved slowly and evenly, each breath arriving without sound and leaving just as gently. There was no tension in his body, no readiness required. Across the room, Watson slept on. His rest was deep and continuous, untouched by thought or dream. His breathing followed a calm, steady rhythm, flowing naturally from one breath to the next. Sleep held him easily, without movement or resistance. The clock continued its quiet presence. Its ticking blended seamlessly into the silence around it, becoming part of the background rather than standing apart. Even when the hour passed, the sound rose softly and faded before it could register as anything more than reassurance. Outside, the city rested beneath snow and darkness. The streets lay smooth and pale, softened by layers of quiet. Lamplight pooled gently along the ground, steady and warm, never flickering, never intruding. Buildings stood patiently, holding warmth inside and releasing nothing but stillness into the cold air. A faint breeze moved now and then, brushing lightly against stone and glass before drifting on. It carried no urgency, no message, only the quiet continuation of air and motion. Inside, the room accepted everything as it was. The shelves stood quietly. The chairs remained steady. The floor held its warmth. Shadows rested comfortably where they had settled, content not to move. Light remained gentle and unchanged. Holmes' awareness softened further. There were no thoughts now, no memories, no images. Only sensation remained, warmth, stillness, the slow rhythm of breath. Inhale, exhale, each breath slow and effortless, each pause wide and comfortable. The fire made no sound. The lamp did not flicker. The room remained perfectly content. Watson stirred once, barely perceptible, then settled again. The movement was instinctive and brief, followed immediately by stillness. Sleep continued without interruption. The room did not respond. It did not need to. Time passed, or perhaps it rested too. The difference had dissolved entirely. Outside, snow continued its slow descent, flake after flake, each one falling without sound, without destination, without concern. Together, they softened the world further, smoothing edges, erasing memory of movement. The city beneath the snow felt distant now, almost unreal, present only as a gentle suggestion beyond the windows. Inside Baker Street, awareness dimmed gently. The room seemed to breathe, warmth expanding slowly. Then settling back again, silence deepened, not by absence, but by fullness. Everything remained, nothing changed. The clock continued. The lamp continued. The embers continued. Holmes remained still. Watson remained asleep. The night carried on, holding each moment lightly, allowing it to dissolve naturally into the next, without boundary or distinction. There was no beginning here, no ending, only continuation. Breath followed breath, warmth followed warmth, quiet followed quiet. And within that steady, unbroken calm, sleep remained deep and secure, supported by repetition, by stillness, and by the gentle certainty that the night would continue, holding everything exactly as it was, for as long as rest was needed.